July 1945. The Potsdam Conference, outside Berlin. The Big Three are meeting to decide the fate of post-war Europe. Joseph Stalin arrives, representing the Soviet Union. The new American president, Harry Truman, is there for his first major international summit. And then Winston Churchill walks in, takes one look at Truman, and you can see it on his face. Disappointment, almost disgust. Churchill had worked with Franklin Roosevelt for years. They'd formed a genuine friendship, a partnership that had won World War II. They'd met 9 times during the war, spent weeks together, exchanged nearly 2,000 messages. Roosevelt was Churchill's equal, wealthy, educated, charismatic, a master strategist who understood global politics. And now Roosevelt was dead, replaced by a failed haberdasher from Missouri who'd never been to college, never traveled outside North America, never held executive office. Churchill looked at Harry Truman and saw a small-town politician completely out of his depth. He wasn't subtle about it. Churchill later described Truman as a modest little man with much to be modest about. That's the polite version he said publicly. What he said privately was much worse. And Truman knew exactly what Churchill thought of him. That contempt, that dismissal, that absolute certainty that Truman would fail shaped everything that came after. Because Truman never forgot an insult, and he spent the next 7 years proving Winston Churchill wrong, even if it meant tearing apart the Anglo-American alliance that had won the war. Let's start with their first meeting at Potsdam, because it was a disaster from the beginning. Truman had been president for 3 months. He was still figuring out how to do the job. He'd never met Stalin or Churchill in person. He'd barely been briefed on the complex agreements Roosevelt had made with both leaders. He was walking into the most important diplomatic conference in history completely unprepared. Churchill knew this. Everyone knew this. The question was whether Churchill would help Truman get up to speed or use Truman's inexperience to Britain's advantage. Churchill chose the latter. Before the conference even started, Churchill tried to manipulate Truman. He sent messages suggesting they meet privately before seeing Stalin, so they could coordinate positions and present a united front. This sounded reasonable, but it was actually a trap. Churchill wanted to lock Truman into supporting British positions before Truman fully understood what those positions were. Truman saw through it. His advisors warned him that Churchill would try to use Roosevelt and Truman's inexperience against him. So Truman refused the private meeting. He insisted that all discussions happen with Stalin present, where everything would be on the record. Churchill was furious. He was used to managing Roosevelt through their personal relationship. Roosevelt would listen to Churchill's eloquent arguments, be swayed by their friendship, and often support British positions, even when they conflicted with American interests. Truman wasn't playing that game. Their first face-to-face meeting was cold. Churchill tried his usual routine, the grand rhetoric, the historical references, the appeal to shared Anglo-American values. Truman listened politely, and then cut to the point. What specifically did Churchill want, and why should America support it? Churchill wasn't used to this. Roosevelt had loved Churchill's speeches. He'd enjoyed the showmanship, the wit, the classical education on display. Truman found it tedious. He was a plain-spoken Midwesterner who valued directness over eloquence. Churchill's style, which had charmed Roosevelt, irritated Truman. The contempt was mutual and immediate. Churchill thought Truman was a provincial ignoramus who didn't understand the subtleties of European politics. Truman thought Churchill was a pompous imperialist trying to manipulate America into protecting the British Empire. They were both partially right. The real clash came over Poland. This was the critical issue at Potsdam. Stalin had installed a communist government in Poland despite promising free elections at Yalta. Churchill wanted Truman to join him in demanding that Stalin honor his commitments. This should have been easy. America and Britain united, confronting Soviet expansion, but Truman suspected Churchill's motives. Britain didn't just care about Polish democracy. Britain wanted to maintain a balance of power in Europe, with Poland as a buffer state. Churchill was asking America to potentially start a conflict with the Soviet Union to serve British strategic interests. Truman wasn't willing to risk American lives for British geopolitics. He pushed back on Stalin about Poland, but not as forcefully as Churchill wanted. Churchill was appalled. He saw this as weakness, as failure, as proof that Truman didn't understand what was at stake. Churchill tried going around Truman. He approached Truman's advisors, trying to convince them to pressure Truman into a harder line. This was incredibly insulting. Imagine a foreign leader trying to manipulate your staff against you. Truman found out and was furious. Whatever chance existed for a working relationship died right there. Then Churchill made it worse. During the conference, Churchill gave a speech about the importance of the Anglo-American alliance, about how Britain and America shared values and destiny, about how they must stand together against tyranny. It was vintage Churchill, soaring rhetoric, historical gravitas, genuinely moving. Except Churchill delivered this speech while barely acknowledging Truman's existence. He talked about Roosevelt constantly. He referenced their friendship, their correspondence, their shared vision. He made clear that Roosevelt had been a true partner, while Truman was just a placeholder. Truman sat there listening to Churchill essentially eulogize the president Truman had replaced, painting Roosevelt as a giant and implying Truman couldn't fill his shoes. It was humiliating, and it was deliberate. Churchill wanted Truman to understand his place. Truman smiled and applauded politely, and he decided right then that Winston Churchill was not someone he would trust or accommodate. The Potsdam Conference was interrupted by the British election. Churchill left to campaign, confident he'd win. Instead, the British people voted him out in a landslide. Clement Attlee of the Labour Party became Prime Minister. Churchill returned to Potsdam not as Prime Minister, but as a defeated politician packing his bags. Truman's reaction to this was telling. He was gracious to Churchill publicly, but privately, he was delighted. Churchill's arrogance had been built on power. Now Churchill had neither power nor the personal relationship with Roosevelt that had made him influential. He was just another opposition politician. Attlee was easier to work with. He was straightforward, practical, less invested in grand strategy, and more focused on Britain's immediate problems. Truman could do business with Attlee, but the damage to Anglo-American relations had been done. Churchill's contempt for Truman had convinced Truman that America saw America as a junior partner to be manipulated, not an equal ally. And Truman was determined to prove that America would set its own course regardless of what Britain wanted. This played out most dramatically over atomic weapons. Truman made the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan without consulting Britain, even though Britain had been a partner in developing the bomb. Churchill, still Prime Minister when Hiroshima was bombed, found out about it from public announcements like everyone else. Churchill was outraged. There had been agreements about joint decision-making on atomic weapons. Truman ignored them. This wasn't just about Japan. This was Truman sending a message. America has the bomb. America will decide how to use it, and Britain's opinion is irrelevant. After Churchill lost the election and returned to opposition, he began speaking out about Soviet expansion. In March 1946, Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Missouri, Truman's home state. Truman was in the audience. Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the free world from Soviet-dominated territories. The speech was powerful and prescient. Churchill was right about Soviet intentions, but Truman's reaction was complicated. Publicly, he praised the speech. Privately, he was annoyed, because Churchill was trying to do what he'd tried at Potsdam: manipulate American foreign policy to serve British interests. Churchill wanted America to commit to defending Western Europe from Soviet expansion. That would allow Britain to maintain its great power status without bankrupting itself on defense spending. Churchill was essentially asking America to guarantee European security so Britain wouldn't have to. Truman understood this. He would eventually commit to defending Western Europe through NATO and the Marshall Plan. But he did it on American terms, for American reasons, not because Winston Churchill said so. And he made sure Churchill got no credit for influencing the decision. There's a deeper issue here about class and background that poisoned the Truman-Churchill relationship. Churchill was born into aristocracy. His father was a prominent politician. He attended elite schools. He was commissioned as a cavalry officer. He spent his youth as a war correspondent and adventurer. He expected deference based on his background and accomplishments. Truman was born on a farm. His father was a livestock trader who went bankrupt. Truman couldn't afford to attend college. He worked as a bank clerk and a farmer. His haberdashery business failed. He got into politics through a corrupt machine. Everything he achieved came through grinding work and political skill, not inherited advantage. Churchill looked at Truman and saw someone from a lower class who didn't belong at the table with real statesmen. Truman looked at Churchill and saw an entitled aristocrat who'd never had to struggle for anything. Neither could respect the other's path to power. This class resentment shaped their entire relationship. Churchill would make classical references or quote historical figures, showing off his education. Truman would respond with blunt Missouri common sense, implicitly dismissing Churchill's erudition as useless showmanship. They were speaking different languages, and neither cared to learn the other's. The breaking point came over India and British colonialism. Truman believed colonialism was morally wrong and practically obsolete. Churchill was a dedicated imperialist who'd once said he hadn't become prime minister to oversee the liquidation of the British Empire. When India demanded independence after the war, Truman supported it. Churchill was horrified. Churchill tried to convince Truman that Indian independence would be a disaster. He argued that Indians weren't ready for self-government, that the subcontinent would descend into chaos, that Britain had a duty to maintain order. It was classic colonial paternalism, dressed up as concern for the colonized people. Truman wasn't buying it. He told Churchill directly that the age of empires was over, that people had a right to self-determination, and that America would support independence movements. Churchill responded with barely concealed rage. How dare this provincial American lecture him about empire and civilization? When India gained independence in 1947, the partition led to horrific violence between Hindus and Muslims. Millions were displaced. Hundreds of thousands died. Churchill pointed to this as proof he'd been right. Truman could have responded by noting that centuries of British colonial rule had created the conditions for partition violence. But he didn't bother. He'd already dismissed Churchill as irrelevant. Churchill spent his remaining years in politics trying to restore his influence with America. He courted Truman's successors. He wrote histories of World War II that emphasized his partnership with Roosevelt and barely mentioned Truman. He gave speeches about the special relationship between Britain and America. But his relationship with Truman never recovered. When Churchill finally retired in 1955, Truman sent a polite congratulatory message. Nothing warm, nothing personal, just the minimum required by diplomatic courtesy. Years later, after both men were out of office, someone asked Truman about Churchill. Truman's response was revealing. Churchill was a great wartime leader, but he never understood that the war changed everything. He wanted to go back to the 19th century, with Britain running a quarter of the world and America supporting Britain's empire. I wasn't going to let that happen. That's what their conflict was really about. Churchill represented the old world order, European empires, balance of power politics, aristocratic leadership, Britain as a global hegemon. Truman represented the new order, American dominance, anti-colonialism, democratic leadership, practical problem-solving over grand strategy. Churchill knew his world was dying. He saw Truman as the symbol of its death, and he hated Truman for it. The irony is that Churchill was wrong about Truman in almost every way. He thought Truman would be weak. Truman made some of the toughest decisions in American history. He thought Truman didn't understand foreign policy. Truman rebuilt Europe, contained Soviet expansion, and established the framework that won the Cold War. He thought Truman would fail. Truman became one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century. But Churchill couldn't admit he'd been wrong. That would require acknowledging that birth and education didn't automatically produce superior leadership. That common sense and decisiveness could match classical learning and eloquent speeches. That a failed haberdasher from Missouri could be a better leader than an aristocratic graduate of Harrow and Sandhurst. Churchill's contempt for Truman revealed his own limitations. He was brilliant, but also blind to how the world had changed. He won the war, but couldn't adapt to the peace. He was a great man, trapped in an obsolete worldview. Truman's response to Churchill's contempt showed his strengths. He didn't need Churchill's approval. He didn't care what British aristocrats thought of him. He had a job to do, and he'd do it his way. If that meant ignoring Churchill's advice and rejecting Britain's attempts to manipulate American policy, so be it. The special relationship between Britain and America survived despite Truman and Churchill's mutual dislike. But it survived on American terms, with Britain as the junior partner. Exactly the opposite of what Churchill wanted. There's a broader lesson here about leadership and respect. Churchill assumed Truman would fail because Truman lacked Churchill's background and credentials. This is a mistake powerful people make constantly, confusing credentials with capability, background with judgment, eloquence with wisdom. Truman proved that none of those things mattered as much as character, decisiveness, and willingness to make hard choices. He had no classical education, but he read history voraciously and learned from it. He had no diplomatic experience, but he understood power and how to use it. He had no aristocratic polish, but he had integrity and common sense. Churchill never understood this. To the end of his life, he believed Truman had been the wrong man for the job, that Roosevelt's death had been a catastrophe for Anglo-American relations. He wrote histories that minimized Truman's role and emphasized his own partnership with Roosevelt. But history has been kinder to Truman than Churchill was. Historians now recognize that Truman's presidency was transformative. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, desegregating the military, recognizing Israel, standing up to Stalin, containing Soviet expansion. These were enormous achievements that shaped the world for decades. Churchill's post-war years, by contrast, were marked by failure. He couldn't prevent Indian independence. He couldn't maintain Britain's empire. He couldn't restore Britain's great power status. He couldn't influence American foreign policy the way he'd influenced Roosevelt. His second term as Prime Minister, from 1951 to 1955, accomplished little. So who was right? The aristocrat who was certain the provincial American would fail, or the provincial American who proved the aristocrat wrong about everything? The answer is obvious, but what's interesting is why Churchill was so wrong. It wasn't just prejudice, though that played a role. It was deeper. Churchill couldn't imagine that someone unlike himself could be successful. His entire worldview was built on the idea that certain backgrounds, certain educations, certain experiences prepared people for leadership, while others didn't. Truman's success destroyed that worldview. It proved that leadership comes from character, not credentials, that common people can make uncommon choices, that democracy actually works, even when it elevates people that aristocrats dismiss as inferior. Churchill's insult, his certainty that Truman would fail, became Truman's motivation. Every time Truman made a tough decision, every time he faced criticism, every time someone questioned whether he was up to the job, he remembered Churchill's contempt. And he proved Churchill wrong again. That's the real story of why Churchill knew Truman would fail. Not because Churchill had special insight, but because Churchill couldn't imagine a world where people like Truman succeeded. And when Truman succeeded anyway, Churchill couldn't admit he'd been wrong. So he rewrote history to minimize Truman and emphasize his own importance. But history doesn't care what Churchill thought. The record is clear. Truman succeeded. Churchill's prediction failed. And the insult Truman never forgot became the fuel that powered one of the most consequential presidencies in American history. Sometimes the best revenge is success. And Harry Truman spent 7 years proving that a modest little man from Missouri had nothing to be modest about.